Hello, hello, and welcome to another episode of Homeschool Moms Unfiltered. I'm your host, Amanda, and my awesome co-host is...
Hello, I'm Megan.
Hey. So we are your source for messy, imperfect homeschooling advice, support, and community.
Yes, true story. We are also your source for progressive, secular homeschool advice, support, and community. Around here, we believe no human is illegal. Women's rights and trans rights are human rights. DEI isn't a weakness. It's a minimum standard to live by. Due process is still the law of the land and should apply to everyone, especially in the US, where it is part of the federal constitution. And frankly, that is just the tip of the iceberg of what we believe. But that should give you an idea of whether or not we are your people.
Yeah, right? If you listened to that and thought, I think these might actually be my people, we hope we are. And we're so happy that you're here. Now, usually we banter, we give life updates in our quest to generally keep it real and help counteract that whole influencer thing where you always walk away feeling less than. And then we chat and banter away an hour of your day. But today we've got a special guest and a whole bunch of questions. So we're just going to go ahead and dive right in.
I know, exciting times. So today we are chatting with Tess from the Coalition for Responsible Home Education. We're doing a few episodes around homeschooling and whether or not there needs to be more homeschool regulations. In our regular episodes, Amanda and I will talk more about that from our own personal perspectives, which you will not be shocked to learn. Very. Okay. That's kind of what we're all about here. But today, we're lucky enough to be able to have a really genuine and potentially a little bit challenging discussion with Tess. So before we ask our first question, would you like to introduce yourself, Tess? And if I could add to that, I'd love for you to include in that, which you probably would have anyway, but just in case, a little bit about your own homeschool journey, because I feel like that gives the audience a little bit more perspective in the whole kind of consider your source way. So welcome, Tess. Would you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm Tess Ulrey. I'm the current executive director for CRHE, the Coalition for Responsible Home Education. My biggest credential for this role is that I'm a homeschool grad myself. I was homeschooled for 6 out of 12 years. I went in and out of school depending on where my family lived and what the best fit for us was at that time. That is actually emblematic of what a current homeschooler looks like now in the United States. So even though current homeschooling regulation has a deep connection to the right wing and especially the Christian nationalism movement, I was actually homeschooled in a very secular way by my mother, who was a teacher both before and after I was homeschooled as well. So I come to this discussion, again, as a homeschool grad, but with experience in public, private, and international schools in there as well. Now, as an adult, I spent my entire professional career in youth-serving nonprofit work. I worked for the Y for a long time, a wonderful organization called Girls on the Run, and then for the Boys and Girls Club. So in those roles, I became really familiar with the type of wraparound services that a society provides children, no matter their education modality. When I worked at the Boys and Girls Club, I wasn't a teacher. I was simply a safe adult for kids, no matter what school district they were in, no matter if they were homeschooled or anywhere in between. So I think that those experiences really lended an interesting lens to the current position I have now, where I'm able to blend my own unique educational background alongside my professional experiences serving youth, and then my own deep devotion to progressive politics as well.
So you found your people with us today too. I like it.
I did. Yes.
You're in the right spot.
Yeah, for sure. Well, again, thank you so much for joining us. Megan said it, but let me make sure I also say it. And so for listeners who may be new to your work, what is Coalition for Responsible Home Education and why did it even need to exist?
Yeah, so our organization was founded way back in 2013 by homeschool alumni. That makes us really unique in this education space because we are the only organization that is founded by alumni and continues to be alumni-led as well. My entire staff is alumni. Everyone except one person on my board is a homeschool alumni as well. And we represent the broad experiences that homeschoolers have. Some of us had really positive homeschool experiences. Some of us had very negative homeschool experiences. Some had unschooling, progressive experiences, and some had very, very domineering Christian upbringings as well. All of those experiences are important as we center children in this work. What our organization really serves to do is to make sure that children's rights are centered in the homeschool conversation. The landscape of homeschooling conversations tends to be pretty exclusively parents' rights. We hear a lot about a parent's rights to do what they want, a parent's freedoms, and a parent's liberties. But what never quite comes up in that conversation are children's rights. Now, we know we function in U.S. policy, and we know that the U.S. is behind in children's rights in a lot of ways. We remain the only country that has not signed on to the U.S. Declaration on the Rights of the Child. I mean, we are not doing so well in this country when we consider children's rights. But we have areas of policy, like in homeschool policy, where we can actually center children's rights. What that means, though, is that alumni voice remains centered. When we're talking about children's rights, who are the children who are homeschooled? That's alumni, and that's the voices that we represent in these conversations.
That's a really interesting point. Around the time that this organization was being founded, which just goes to show how old I am, I was working actually for Eurochild and doing stuff for them there in Belgium and helping them get some things off the ground and fundraising and stuff like that. And it is really interesting how different Europe handles children's rights versus the US, where we claim to be, all about freedom, but also not.
But also rank very poorly on the global rankings for freedom.
We would like to say it, but we don't actually put anything in place that demonstrates that commitment, right?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Freedom as long as it doesn't impinge on my freedom. Like you can have your freedom as long as it works with my freedom.
Selective freedom.
We're that way, yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So you mentioned your organization was founded by former homeschool students and talked a bit about how that affects your work. So I'm curious if you could just dig in a little bit more, the ways that having that pod of homeschool alumni has shaped your organization's priorities differently than parent-led homeschool advocacy groups, kind of like the giant Great Satan HSLDA is what's popping into my head right now. So
Yeah, I mean, I will tell you that we operate at less than 1% of HSLDA's operating budget. I'm proud of that when you look at the policy work and the advocacy that we do, and the fact we've been able to keep our heads up in this kind of a fight, because that, HSLDA, it is a force to be reckoned with, definitely. And not just exclusive to HSLDA, but to a lot of homeschooling groups. It is that, it's the parents that are driving the conversation. What's so important to us about that is, as homeschool alumni, we are able to kind of uniquely identify places in our own experiences, especially as adults reflecting back on our experiences, where things could have been improved either for us or for our peers, and where there's a genuine policy answer to some of that. And a genuine policy answer that doesn't necessarily mean that, everyone is all of a sudden under state rule or anything scary like that, but just some of these regulations are kind of like, we prefer oversight, right? That we just say, hey, this is oversight that is going to guarantee that every homeschool child has the same access to an open future.
I love that you mentioned about state-run education, because I left that giant Facebook group, that hip homeschool moms, the day...
That was a long time ago.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I got a nasty gram from the lady one day, but the day that Biden was elected, because they were all wondering where they should move when we become communist. And I was like... It's the straw that I have to go. I had been hanging on and I just can't do it anymore. Right. So,
yeah.
All right. So I have homeschooled personally in the South for many years in 4 different Southeastern states. And the South is kind of known as the land of sign this statement of belief if you want to join our co-op. And so we figured when we started this podcast, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And so we kick off our episode like we did today with our statement of beliefs. We kind of jokingly refer to it as our bat signal to find other secular and progressive homeschoolers. But keeping that in mind, I'm curious, and you mentioned you're a progressive. From that political standpoint, why do you think that we should engage in discussion around homeschool education? And kind of from a different perspective, are there marginalized groups who you think are harmed by the lack of regulation that CRHE kind of focuses in on? Maybe not, but in general, kind of as a big bubble question, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think as a big bubble question, I think it's important that we don't separate public school children to homeschooled children, that we engage in this kind of a conversation about what are things we can put in place that are genuinely going to protect and support all of the children in our community. I want to engage in these conversations and this type of oversight because I firmly believe that as adults, we have a responsibility to every child in our community. And at some point, we're all going to need to step up and make sure that that happens for our neighbors' children, for other. I should put this in my intro. I have two kids of my own. I have a seventh grader and a third grader. I'll give their grade levels because they do go to public school. I don't think that they have any more or less rights to safety than their homeschooled peers as well. And so I think that when we are talking about this, we have to frame it within the education modality, because the reality of how we've set up our society is that services and protections tend to come through the school system. Again, that's both resources and precautions tend to come through the school system. So we have to address homeschooling as well. But on a broader sense, we should be talking about our responsibility to all children.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I think that's totally true. And you make a really good point. We're talking about it. I love the fact that the organization Coalition for Responsible Home Educating or Education is made up of homeschoolers that had both good experiences and bad experiences, because so much of what you hear right now is that there's like the homeschoolers of TikTok and there's the Reddit threads that are essentially the bad version of Yelp reviews where you're like, okay, these people only came here to complain. And that happens a lot, right? When things are good, we enjoy the good times. And when things are bad, we make sure everyone knows that it was bad. And so making sure that there's a balance and we find a balance, I think, is really important. So I guess kind of with that in mind as well, what is, in your opinion, what is the most common misconception people have when they hear the term homeschool regulation?
Yeah, I think, and I'm just gonna be honest, I hate regulation. We prefer oversight. I think
Mhm.
for exactly that reason, right? Even myself, I hear regulation and I go, ooh. However, that's the word, that's the vernacular, and we can lean into it. I'm glad you brought up, though, we hear so much in homeschooling, right, about these glowing positive reviews. And then there's some extraordinarily traumatic and negative experiences too. And that gamut is important. One thing that's important for us in these oversight or regulation conversations is making sure that we can accurately represent that full spectrum through data as well. So what I'm particularly proud of that our organization does is novel research that includes the good, the bad, and the ugly of homeschooling. We can't have genuine conversations if we are ignoring those terrible, terrible outcomes. We also can't have genuine homeschooling conversations if we're focused the other way, right? It's so important that we're able to sort of, sit, and understandably, sometimes these are uncomfortable conversations too to sit with, right? But we need to be able to sit with that broad depth of experience. And so when we're talking about regulation and oversight, what we are trying to do is bring everyone together so that the worst of the worst doesn't happen. Our goal is never going to be, and I would be challenged to find a lawmaker whose goal was ever going to be that they wanted to control every single thing happening in your home, that they wanted to dictate exactly what you were saying. But I think it's important to have that kind of spectrum of understanding in that. And so our goal in oversight truly is to make sure that the worst of the worst can't happen, as much as we have a responsibility to.
Yeah, because the worst of the worst, we've heard those examples, and
Mhm.
they're bad, right? It's just outright abuse. Protecting abusers is, it's how, I mean, how can you come out and say, I want a progressive society and I love children and all of this and equality, but I want to protect abuse. And unfortunately, that's a lot of what happens right now in the homeschool space. So
Mhm.
that's the tough part.
That's the tough
Okay,
part. And I think it's
so
also important for someone like me to be able to come in and have these conversations with you. I'm not the product of abuse or neglect.
mhm.
However, I do share some commonality because I am an alumni and I share that same educational upbringing. And so I can speak to that and advocate. And that's an important space to hold. So thank you for holding it, because I know it's not an easy thing to come to us with.
I know. It was like, should we do this episode? Because it's going to be a lightning rod, right? And we're kind of like, the more lightning rod, the better at this point. Like, let's have the hard
Yeah.
conversations because somebody has to hold them. Okay. So part of the path of how we got to Tess is there was an article in the New York Times talking about homeschool regulation that got posted in one of the Facebook groups that I'm in, as in, can you believe they want to regulate homeschooling? This is ridiculous, blah, blah, blah. Here's this New York Times article. And so I read the article, and that led us to Tess. The article was based on a new book that was coming out by a man named Stephen Merrill Block. He wrote a book called Homeschooled, a Memoir. It's now a New York Times bestseller. It's a relatively new book. It only just came out a little bit ago. And is it not a New York Times bestseller, Amanda? Did you Google it? Am I wrong?
Oh, it is. Yes.
No,
Oh,
it
okay.
is. My face was because I don't think it deserves being a New York Times bestseller, but that's a whole other story and
Oh, okay.
conversation.
Gotcha.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. I was like, did I Google it wrong? Okay. It's a New York Times bestseller. Jenna Bush Hager is doing it. I didn't know Jenna Bush Hager had a book club, but hey, okay. We love a good book club. We have one too. So Amanda and I will invariably talk more about this next week. We're going to debrief more on this topic. So I won't go too deep here, but if you look at the reviews online for the book, a lot of homeschoolers come out and attack the book going, this isn't about homeschooling. This is about mental illness because this person had a really, really difficult homeschool experience. And we'll talk more about that in our next episode. So while there's definitely the case that his mother suffered from mental illness, my question is, in a case like that, where does your organization envision drawing the line between government overreach and child protection? Like, obviously, we don't want the experience that Stefan describes in his book. But at the same time, like, I suffer from anxiety. I talk about it on the podcast all the time. And it's like the core of my personality at this point. I take medication for it. I don't mind talking about it. So like, who's going to say that I'm not too unstable to homeschool my kids? Where does that line get drawn safely?
Yeah, I think that with that, what's kind of interesting about some story there is some of that isolation and frankly the codependency that occurs then between him and his mother, that is kind of unique to his homeschooling experience in that case. Had he been in school, that would have been
Yeah.
profoundly different. And for Stefan, it was important. He named his book Homeschooling. So it goes back a little bit, in our case, to centering that alumni and that survivor experience. If that part of his connection with his mother, the connection of her as both his parent and his educator, was important enough for him to call it homeschooling, we know there's a link there, right?
Mm-hmm.
I would say that in a lot of the policy that we advocate for, an experience like Stefan, there would have been a couple key pieces. Again, this isn't what we recommend in terms of policy, where that would have been a little bit different. Some of the recommendations that we have around assessment would have improved Stefan, especially as he was going into high school and realizing, one of the most poignant things I think in his book was when he had that description about describing the philosophers to his teachers, right?
Mm-hmm.
Had he been held to the same standardized assessments that other children in Texas were, there would have been an educational gap that would have been identified, and there would have been more conversation and resources that would have happened. And I have to believe those conversations and resources would have improved Stefan's experience, but they had to have improved his mother's too. There's an amount, when I read that book, an amount of my heart as a mother myself that kind of goes out to his own mother.
Of
I mean,
course.
she was in a difficult position as well. And so I
Mm-hmm.
think that it's always a yes and with these kind of conversations. And so a lot of the oversight that we recommend just connects children to more resources, and parents benefit from that too.
Yeah. Yeah. Because my thought is when I read the Amazon reviews, I'm like, yes, the book is about mental illness, but it affected the kid's entire life. And because he was with her 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, they're connected, right? You can't single it out and say this has nothing to do with homeschooling. I'm like, it has everything to do with homeschooling. But who's to say then that anybody who has mental illness can't homeschool? That's where I get like, who's making these decisions, right? Who's kind of drawing these lines in the sand and saying like what is and isn't okay when it comes to regulation?
Yeah, and we have specific recommendations. We call them parental qualifiers. I understand that's a scary word, but it is the reality of what we recommend. Some of our recommendations around parental qualifiers, we do recommend that parents who are convicted of crimes against children are not allowed to homeschool. Right now, there's only 2 states that restrict that, and there's essentially valves where they can remove that if possible. There's also only 1 state that if a child is in the middle of an active substantiated CPS investigation, that they're protected from being homeschooled. And the reason I say that is a red flag for some of these really terrible outcomes we talk about. If a family is being actively investigated by CPS and they're frustrated with the fact they're being investigated, they yank their kid out to homeschool. We call that non-purposeful homeschooling. It's not a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
There's 1 state that restricts that. So when we talk about parental qualifiers, that is what we are talking about parental qualifiers. Ultimately, we're asking for less than we ask public school teachers.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And we get fought on those harder than you would ever believe.
I can't. I'm like the fact that sexual offenders can homeschool. They're like, how are you getting fought on this?
And shout out to Arkansas. They're the ones that protect that. Like I said, it's never better. It is never better blue. It is never better blue in homeschooling.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely complicated. And we started off the episode talking about that. And I do appreciate the fact that at the very top of the episode, right, we talked a bit about how it's about children's rights, and yes, you can't specifically separate the homeschooling and the mental illness part. But at the same time, you also have plenty of kids who go through regular schooling or whatever that may be, who have parents with mental illness that have suffered in a way or have codependent relationships that definitely require lots of therapy afterwards and sorting through. And so, this idea of really focusing on all of the systems that go into place to supporting kids, regardless of where their education is coming from, and really making sure that we're focusing on children's rights and parental responsibility. I think that's a really interesting take on it. But I digress. So, our next question for you is, how do you respond to the homeschool parents and community who say any oversight is a slippery slope?
This is always a challenging one for me because I cannot ever say, the slippery slope argument. I hate it. I'll just be frank. I hate the slippery slope argument because a little bit the slippery slope argument is how we got here, right? Homeschooling, when it first happened, it was working in concert with the public schools. It was a really, really kind of mutually beneficial relationship. And the slippery slope that was essentially Michael Ferris and some of those HSLDA devotees really systematically just removed all protections for children. So the slippery slope is how we got here. But I have seen firsthand how difficult these conversations are. I mentioned even the fact that we're unable to pass Rayleigh's Law in West Virginia, which is one of those bills that would be specifically addressing removing children to be homeschooled in the middle of an active investigation. If I can't get that across the finish line, talk to me later about a slippery slope, right? I mean, we're so far, that is nowhere near anything we are talking about in any way, shape, or form. And I think the other thing that's been demonstrated, both with how homeschooling got to where it is and where we're trying to build it up to, is each and every state dictates education in such a strong and specific way. I can't ever see us as a country agreeing on it in either direction.
Yeah. We can't agree that
Yeah.
human beings have human rights. So, yeah, we're a long way from a lot of things right now, right?
Yeah,
And it's just
yeah.
getting worse by the day. So,
Yep.
that's a great way to think about the slippery slope. I hadn't thought about it from that perspective. Yeah, that makes perfect sense, right? I mean, if you can't get the very basics of common sense things passed, we're not slipping and sliding anywhere anytime soon, right? So,
Mhm.
yeah,
No, no.
yeah, that makes
Not in my
sense.
lifetime. It's not going to happen. I'm 37. I don't think that's going to happen in my lifetime.
Yeah, that makes great sense. Okay, so then on the flip side, if you could kind of wave a magic wand and you could get things passed and
Mhm.
pushed through and where you would ultimately like them to be, what would common sense regulation look like to you? From everything from how to get approved to homeschool to maybe annual check-ins or assessments or any of the above. What does it look like in your world?
Yeah, I think we have kind of two ways that we think about it. We think about it in terms of child protection and child welfare, and we also think about it in terms of resources as well. Depending on where you are in the United States, I can use Michigan as an example because I live over here, especially in some of the rural communities that are in Michigan. Sometimes the only access that high school age children will have to sports or to extracurriculars is going to be through their local high school. That looks different when you live in a more populated urban area with lots and lots of different resources. That's not the case in a lot of rural communities in Michigan. So one of the things that we advocate for in terms of resources is making sure that states and school districts are set up to not just accept, but support homeschoolers who want to access some of those additional resources. That's really important to us because we could talk to the ends of the earth about how important it is for kids to have social emotional development opportunities. The reality is too, is if college is in your plan or any of that post-secondary, it's going to be critical for you to have sports, theater, any of that. We also think that school districts need to work better with students to make sure they can access things like AP credits. If you want to go to a school that is not set up for homeschoolers, you're going to need to prove you're kind of working in concert with some of those things that are a little bit more measured. On the child welfare side of that too, we would like to see a little bit more visibility for homeschooled children. What becomes incredibly challenging, especially in 12 states across the country, we don't know how many kids are homeschooled because there is no reporting system for that at all. A child can never attend school, or if a child stops showing up to school and you can't get a hold of the parents, they're de facto homeschooled. That's how it's considered. So we have no way of knowing how many homeschooled children actually exist. We can give you our best guess, but we don't know how many that is. So we would like to see a process of registration, check-in, and kind of a notification to homeschool, because for us, that's a big indicator of whether that's purposeful or non-purposeful homeschooling. I think those are important distinctions to make when we start to veer into the realm of talking about abuse and neglect prevention, right? There's purposeful homeschooling and there's non-purposeful homeschooling. And those are going to be important differentials when we're talking about it. So we'd like a registration system. We would like an assessment system, however that works for the state and for the families. That looks a little bit different. There's one state that allows for portfolio reviews every couple of years. Homeschoolers are not always going to respond to standardized tests, but a portfolio review is a great way to just kind of have that check-in. And it loops back to the resources, right? Because, hey, if there are some learning differences, the schools hold those type of resources. So we'd like to see whether that's standardized tests, portfolio review, however it works for a family and a state. We're flexible, but it's those kind of valves of where we could have a little bit of visibility to some of those children. So that's really what we'd be advocating for.
I like those. I like the term purposeful homeschooling as well,
Mhm.
because I was talking to Amanda in a previous episode about how reading Stefan's book made me think that I need a different term as an unschooler, because it's such this wide range of approaches. And our approach has been very goal driven and like very life coaching, basically, where I'm with the kids. What do you want to do? And how are we going to do it? And what goals do you have? And how are we going to get there? And how can I support you? And all of that. And then you have Stefan's experience, right? And so I'm like, within the world of unschooling, you have this huge thing. And I go, I feel like I need a term that shows that I'm at this end of the unschooling spectrum when we talk about that. And I said, I haven't decided on an adjective, but purposeful just got bumped up on the list. I really like that one for for that description there. So yeah, I like it.
Yeah, and,
Yeah.
and that's actually terminology we use. This is veering off a little bit, but we do an entire training series for individuals who are child welfare workers, but also librarians, frontline healthcare workers, to identify the unique risks of abuse and neglect in a homeschool setting. And that's the way we talk about homeschooling there too. We say, hey, these families that are coming to you, let's talk about what purposeful versus non-purposeful homeschooling looks like. Because a purposefully homeschooling family, right, they're going to talk your ear off about their curriculum. They're proud of what their children are doing, and their children are able to vocalize that as well. Non-purposeful looks a lot different.
Mm-hmm. True.
Yeah, I also really liked how you brought up talking about like homeschool kids being able to access the programs at the local public schools. I'm homeschooling in California. We have an interesting, different kind of setup here, and we have the charter system. We have the homeschool charter system, but it's a real struggle here to be able to access that and get any sort of anything with your local school district if you're homeschooling. And I hope that we can touch on that a little bit later, because spoiler alert, anyone who listens to us regularly is not going to be surprised to know that I totally combed through your website. And I know that that's something that you hit on your website. So I'll leave it at that, and hopefully we'll circle back to it in a little bit.
Yeah. And then on the flip side, from Amanda's California experience, I've homeschooled in Texas, which is one of the we don't even know your kids exist states. So yeah, full range of experience here.
The constitutional amendment to affirm parents' rights was a choice.
Ooh, yeah. Okay. So
It was a choice.
It was a choice.
Let me tell you, I spent 2 years in Texas, not by choice. It was for my husband's work transfer life. And there were a lot of choices made there. So yeah, it was a long 2 years. Okay. Yeah. So invariably, people are going to make the argument against everything we've said so far in this episode that abuse happens in the public schools too, or not so much that it's necessarily happening in the public school system. It is, right? But that's not the entirety of what we're talking about. There are also instances where children are being abused at home and it's not caught in the public school system. And so a lot of times that's an argument against homeschooling, is like, well, who's keeping an eye on these kids? And then, of course, we hear horror stories about kids who go for 12 years and no one picks up on the abuse that they've experienced at home. And in fact, we've talked a little bit on social media about the fact that we have this episode coming up and that we were going to be discussing this, and we've already gotten, abuse happens in school too, or, the school system doesn't recognize abuse either. So stay out of homeschooling. So how does that look in your world?
Yeah, really familiar with that. And yes, child abuse happens everywhere. It's an uncomfortable thing to sit with, again, no matter the education modality. One way that we phrase it is it's not an either or question, right? It's a both and. It would be irresponsible for us to ignore child abuse within the homeschool setting until we've somehow miraculously solved it in the public school setting. And that sometimes seems to be what people want us to do. Our organization focuses on homeschoolers. There are organizations doing incredible work addressing child abuse in other places. Our calling is in homeschooling. So yes, that is where we focus. Homeschooling is not free of abuse and neglect. Public school is not free of abuse and neglect. It is the reality. So I think that the place it becomes harder to sit with is, again, we're talking about our own kids. I have kids as well. I know it's unique when we're talking about that versus maybe how a teacher would interact with that. But I think it goes back to the responsibility that we have to all children, every education modality. As a public school parent myself, I don't necessarily think that there's a moral high ground. Just because someone homeschools, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're a better person. Because I send my kids to public school, it doesn't mean that I'm a worse person. We're all parents, and these are all kids.
Yeah. That's the easiest way I've ever heard someone define that. Yes, it's happening here, but it's also happening there, and none of it's okay. We need to address it.
There's no acceptable percentage. There is none.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think I'm with you. I've never heard anyone actually lay it out quite like that, but I'm not sure any of us can argue like, well, we should allow it to continue here until we fixed it over there. Like, well, no, maybe we should be working to fix it everywhere. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so big picture question.
Mhm.
If you could wave a magic wand and design an ideal homeschool oversight, is that the word you said you liked? Regulation is the one that happens.
And we use them both. It's okay.
Okay. So if you could design an ideal homeschool regulation system in the United States, what would it include and what would it intentionally avoid?
Yeah, I think we would intentionally include aspects that directly address child welfare, especially in abuse and neglect prevention, but those would go hand in hand with resources and access. I don't believe you can have one without the other. And whenever we're proposing policy or legislation, there's aspects of both of those that go hand in hand. In terms of intentionally avoiding, people choose to homeschool for a variety of reasons. It used to be because the family was probably very religious and felt like there was an ideological calling to that. And that's not the reality anymore. Research is proving more and more people homeschool for all sorts of different reasons. People go in and out of the school system more and more. We know that it's more diverse, it's more fluid than it has ever been. So we would never recommend policy or work on anything that removed that really important flexibility for children. For some children, it is going to be the best fit. And so there's never anything we would do that would remove that as an option for children, especially when we think about all the things that can challenge children about public school and why it's not always the safest environment. That can be gun violence. Some school districts are not safe for queer kids. We want to make sure that the option remains for families. But again, we want them to have those resources too, right, at home.
Yeah. So when Amanda talks about too, like what it would intentionally avoid, right? We spend a lot of time in homeschool Facebook groups because we offer courses and unit studies, and we have the podcast, and we have a Patreon, and we do coaching and all that kind of stuff. So we're engaging in conversation with people all the time and saying like, hey, we have these resources and they're available, and et cetera, et cetera. Spending a lot of time in homeschool Facebook groups is fun. We get to connect with a lot of really awesome people. And then there are also the moments where we grab a screenshot and send it to the other one and go, what the hell is happening? So that is, hey, I'm looking for a flat earth curriculum, or I need something for history for my high schooler that's not woke. There was one about something about the moon landing one day, and the person was like, should I go with the scripted version or the real version? And I was like, I'm not sure which one is which in your world. I just know about the moon landing, right? So what am I missing, Amanda? What other ones?
I mean, like just that I want my kids to get involved in a local sport, but I'm not willing to risk them being indoctrinated with furry culture. And you're like, what? How did we get here?
Yeah. Okay. I lived in South Carolina, and there was a lot of, I need a Christian soccer team. And I was like, Well, yeah, I mean, I don't want my kid passing a ball to someone unless they have an option to be friends for eternity in the afterlife. I mean, why invest the time now if it's not for eternity? Like
Yeah.
I can't. And
Well,
so,
I'm just like, is the hometown rival between like the Christians and Satan? Like, where
right.
is that? Like, I don't like, okay.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, we survived like this past year, right? We passed quote unquote Columbus Day. Anybody have any good resources for Columbus Day? And every comment section turns into a whole, you mean besides the fact that he was a rapist and a murderer? And then other people are like, stop rewriting history. And I can't. And so in your world, it's like, we've talked about abuse, which obviously is the top level thing. And you're like, we need to solve abuse. That needs to be
Mhm.
the big thing first. But as we're watching our society crumble and our democracy crumble and the lack of critical thinking skills that have gotten us to this point, I mean, you watch these debating shows where people come on, and there was one the other day where somebody said they couldn't vote for Kamala because she was a prosecutor. And the debating guy goes, well, so you voted for a felon? And he was like, well, that's a matter of opinion. There's no proof on that. And they're like, no, he was convicted beyond a reasonable, he is a felon. And they genuinely don't know, right? Like, or choose not to believe or whatever is the case. And so how do we as a society fix that lack of critical thinking and that indoctrination? I mean, we have now severe homophobia, severe racism, all of which are on the rise. And how do we fix that as a society and make society a kinder, more open-minded, more welcoming place without trampling parents' rights? Like, do we just allow that indoctrination to carry forth because that's your right? Is that not a form of abuse? It was in the article, I think, in the New York Times, where Stephen Merrill Block proposed that indoctrinating a child into a bubble in his worldview is abusive, right? So is it? Like, what are your thoughts as an organization on that?
Yeah, I think a lot of what we do, we use the phrasing open future a lot. And so in the resources, but also, like I mentioned, almost the pressure valves, right? Are these like intervention times where children would come into contact with adults that just are more safe adults. That's all we want. We want more safe adults to have access to them. Ideally, we are making it possible to have an open future, because if children themselves are never exposed to anything other than what their parents say, we know what's going to happen next. And so the more opportunity we can offer for that open future, for those different viewpoints, is going to move us along in that direction. I can tell you anecdotally from a lot of the homeschool alumni I work with, sometimes that doesn't happen until your mid-20s. Sometimes it
Mhm.
takes a long time, but the more we're willing to engage, the more that we just offer these type of resources. And I think also, to be frank, the less weird we make homeschooling and the less weird we make public school is going to go a long way in that conversation. We talk a lot sometimes about homeschool as homeschool alumni, some of the things that people assume about us when they hear about that part of our educational background. The same goes sometimes when I talk to homeschooling families too. I promise it's on both sides of this conversation, right? And so I think,
Oh, we see them complaining about the kitty litter boxes on social media. And we're like, if you bring up these freaking kitty litter boxes one more time, it has been debunked so many times. And yet here we are.
we're back to that. And the same token is, as a professional before this job, I would not have led with I'm a homeschool graduate, because people are going to think I wear jean skirts and talk about Jesus. That's going to be what people think about me. So I think on both sides of the conversation, the more we can engage in good faith, the better that will happen. And even you guys being willing to host our organization, to hold space for that, goes a long way in just opening up that conversation.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Okay, so how can concerned parents, educators, or former homeschoolers support this work, right? The work of the Coalition for Responsible Home Education in like actual tangible ways? What does your organization recommend?
Yeah, so we kind of sort our work into three categories. We do a lot of advocacy. You've heard me talk a lot about state level policy. So homeschool parents and homeschool alumni are really powerful voices when we are going to a state capitol and we are saying, hey, here's some ideas for legislators that would support that open future, but also prevent abuse and neglect. We need those type of advocates on our side. I think you guys have seen firsthand how powerful and how vocal sometimes the anti-regulation lobby can be. And so it goes a long way. And if people are willing to contact their legislators in support of of policy, that goes a long way too. Legislators get the brunt of kind of some of the scary side of that. So in the advocacy world, there's a lot of very, very tangible ways that people can be a part of that work. We're really proud of the research that we do as well. Dr. Jonah Stewart runs our research department. Jonah is a homeschool alum, but then went to Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship with a PhD in education. That's who's leading our research. We really know our stuff over here. I like to give those credentials because they're important in kind of showing what it is we can do. So in the research space, we have a lot of opportunity for participation in those resources. We also have a lot of homeschool parents who jump into the research with us, and we love having those voices included in our work. We will always center alumni voice. That's one of the tenets of our organization, but currently homeschooling parents are an important part of that too, and really support us in that way. The other thing that kind of the third pillar of our work is in resources. So for homeschool alumni, we do peer groups. It's really fun, especially if you had a alternative education like myself. Meeting other people with that shared experience is a really important part of becoming an adult and learning how to navigate that next step. So we do peer support groups. We say support groups. Sometimes they're just fun, but that's what we do. We run peer groups, and then we also run trainings on abuse and neglect prevention in the homeschool setting. As homeschool alumni, we're able to speak the homeschool language, but we're able to take that out to people who probably have a different idea of what homeschooling looks like and make sure that we're educating the public. So we do that again for child welfare workers. We do that for frontline healthcare workers. We do it for librarians, faith leaders, all across the gamut. And so sometimes if people are interested, especially in supporting the abuse and neglect prevention of what we do, we have opportunities for people to help us not only with that curriculum development, but delivering that to the appropriate audiences too.
And so I'm just going to take a quick minute because you didn't fully plug yourself. But if you're listening and you're like, okay, I am interested in getting involved, they have on their website, which is really easy to find, again, Coalition for Responsible Home Education, and we'll drop the link and all of that jazz. They have a great list of things that you can be doing at the state level, but also at your local community level. It talks about going to the local Board of Education meetings or your city council meetings and asking, why are homeschool kids not allowed access to the school extracurricular activities? What can we do to make sure that they're allowed to come into these spaces? And I don't know very many homeschoolers who can't get behind that, no matter where you fall on this spectrum, right? We all get frustrated with a lack of resources in our local community. And so definitely go check out their website for more ideas and suggestions. I was really impressed with the things that they had on that section of their website. So there you go.
Oh, thanks, Amanda. And I will say one of my favorite things to do is different states sometimes, especially high schoolers, as we're starting to learn about like the civic process. I've got some great resources I'm happy to connect with people about, teaching them how to advocate for themselves too. I worked in youth advocacy for a long time. It's one of my favorite things to do. So letting teenagers use their voice and ask their state and local representatives why they can't participate, that's how we'll get some of this over the line. So if people connect with us, I'm happy to give them some of those focused ones as well. They're really, really great.
Love it.
We saw a post the other day that was somebody who was doing virtual schooling in Texas and showed up to history class and received a dose of just whitewashed fairy tale history. And the teenager themselves posted in a group saying, where can I find some decent history resources? Because I'm going to have to patch this together myself. And we put out resources. We were like, we'll be happy to give you what we have. I mean, we typically sell our stuff on Teachers Pay Teachers, but I'm like, this is a kid who's going to change the world if they're doing this at this. We're like, whatever you need, you just let us
Here
know.
you go.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing that I noted when I was on your site was you have resources for current homeschoolers, like I just mentioned, or grads who are now trying to maybe patch what they don't have if they had a really bubbled educational experience. So how can either existing homeschoolers or alums who are like, whoa, this is not the world I thought I was going to graduate into, and I don't have the skills, how can they lean on your organization for help?
Yeah, I think that, so we have we call it charting your own course, but it specifically addresses homeschoolers who had some gaps in preparation for adulthood and maybe a worldview that wasn't as open as we talk about. So those resources are available on our website. We're plugged into social media as well. What's great is because we are an organization of homeschool alum as well. As soon as homeschool alum reach out, they're reaching a friendly audience. And so between all of our volunteers and our staff, there's somebody that is going to connect directly with their experience again, good, bad, or ugly. And we're happy to connect them directly, because I think that means a lot when you're talking about in this type of work too. You're not shouting into a void. We genuinely are matching you with somebody who has a similar experience.
Yeah, because when I looked at your website and I was looking at, your team members and all that kind of stuff, and I noticed how beautifully diverse your team is
Mhm.
and how many LGBTQIA plus members were on the team. And all I could think was, and it's an assumption on my part, right? But all I could think was how many of these individuals grew up in homes where that was not okay and the messaging that they were receiving was absolutely horrible. It's in Stefan's book, right? Just the casual references that were tossed his way about same-sex relationships and things like that. And so I just think, like, how can we as progressives turn a blind eye to the fact that there are children all over the place in this moment who are being told that who they are is wrong, sinful, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And actively someone is trying to change who they are and all of that. And there's no safeguard in place for those kids. And oh, that was hard to kind of spider web out to when I was looking at
Mhm.
your website and realize that was probably the case for a number of people on your team. And the work that takes as an adult then to unpack.
No, it's, we do joke sometimes that we're overrepresented, in terms of certain aspects, and that, but I think that kind of goes hand in hand with wanting to share and wanting to affect change in your own experience as an adult. So
Mhm.
again, we've got a wide gamut of experiences, but especially some of the people who had some of the most challenging experiences, they are so called to and motivated to support children becoming adults out of that as well. It's really powerful to see that happen on our side as well. And then when we're willing also to have parents who are willing to engage with us at this point to make sure that their children and their children's peers are not in that same situation. Again, I can't tell you how much it means to my staff. When we have, we say oversight open parents who are willing to engage in this conversation with them, how healing that can be for them as well.
Mhm.
To see that there's all of these adults who would have been safe adults for them, and they know that it will be different now for all of these children.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I feel like we need to put like a banner across this episode. I wore a rainbow shirt to make sure anyone who doesn't know us noticed, but I'm sitting so low. I don't know if you can actually see it in the video, and most people listen anyway. But I mean, it's that thing. Like, yes, we're in that sphere, but yes, safe. And it's a real struggle, right? I mean, I think there are so many parents now who are in the position where in one way or another there is some kind of LGBTQIA plus situation in their family, and they're wanting to protect their child and homeschooling to do that. But it is a challenge because the reality is there is still a lot of the other side of that spectrum in the homeschool community. And you want to be careful about putting yourself and your family into those groups where they're on the other side of the spectrum. But at the same time, you want to make sure that those kids that are there and needing that safe adult knows that there is a safe adult and that they have somewhere they can reach out to. It's super complicated. I don't think there's any way of getting around that. Okay. All of that said, Tess, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah.
I really do think that this is just such an important conversation that we need to be having as progressive homeschoolers. And hopefully, for anyone who's listening, we have given folks some food for thought. And again, if you're interested in more, you can find the link to Coalition for Responsible Home Education in our show notes. You can follow us on social media or check out our Patreon community to continue the discussions. We're going to have another episode after this one where Megan and I do our typical dive in and our back and forth. So, you can come listen to us disagree. I'm sure there'll be some disagreement, but hopefully a fair amount of overlap as well. And we'll be sure to drop the links to all of those things in the show notes. So wherever you're listening or watching, you can find that.
Yeah. I mean, if you're new to our podcast and this is your very first episode, that's kind of one of the hallmarks, right? Amanda's an aggressive academic homeschooler. I'm a loosey goosey unschooler, although I'm working on a new label for myself, right? What was the adjective test? Purposeful.
Purposeful. Yep. Purposeful versus non-purposeful. Yeah.
That might be my new adjective. I'm not quite sure yet, but that's kind of our thing. We can disagree on plenty of stuff when it comes to homeschooling, yet I can still be thrilled for Amanda's kiddo's success and she can be happy for my kiddo's success. But we do not agree to disagree on human rights. We're not those people. That's a line in the sand. So yes, thank you so much, Tess, for joining us.
Thank you.
And
I appreciate it.
yeah, absolutely. And for everyone listening, happy homeschooling.
Yeah, have a great one.